What happens when an undercover CEO discovers the quiet janitor everyone ignores is the only one keeping the school from falling apart? You're about to find out. Hello, wonderful listeners. We are so glad you're here. Your kindness, curiosity, and sense of justice make this community truly special. Today's story dives deep into a world of silence, sabotage, and strength, where one man's quiet work speaks louder than all the office politics combined. If you believe in fairness, second chances, and leadership that listens, this one will move you. So sit back, relax, and let's uncover the truth undercover CEO style. Daniel Whitaker had spent over 2 decades building one of the most respected networks of private schools in the country. From a single academy with borrowed desks and chalk-streaked whiteboards, he had grown Sterling Scholars into a 12-campus institution known for academic rigor, polished branding, and elite college placement rates. Parents trusted him, donors applauded him, board members congratulated him, and yet, beneath the applause, Daniel felt something unsettling had crept into his life's work, a disconnect between the values he preached and the culture now festering under his nose. One particular campus, Sterling Heights Preparatory, had recently shown disturbing signs. Staff turnover had quietly doubled in a year. Budget reports seemed off, and complaints, once rare, began trickling in. Vague comments about morale, facility upkeep, and a toxic work environment. When Daniel raised these concerns at a board meeting, they were brushed off as noise. "All metrics are green," someone said. It's just growing pains. But Daniel had built his reputation on more than spreadsheets. He remembered what it meant to walk hallways, shake students' hands, and mop floors himself when a custodian called in sick. That intimacy with the ground floor, he'd lost it. And he knew it. So, without fanfare or press releases, he made a choice. He would go back, not as the revered CEO, but as a new hire, on the bottom rung. Dan Willis, a temporary janitor filling in for the night shift. His suit was replaced with a threadbare uniform, and his executive laptop traded for a mop and keyring. He would walk those dim corridors not with a clipboard, but a dustpan. If there was rot in his institution, he would find it where no one was watching. And this time he would listen not as a leader, but as someone invisible. Because sometimes leadership isn't about speaking. It's about knowing when your voice has gone unheard and choosing to hear someone else's. The air inside Sterling Heights Preparatory was starkly different after dark. Gone were the polished smiles of day staff and the cheerful buzz of students. In their place hung the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint scent of industrial cleaner. Daniel Whitaker, now known only as Dan Willis, stood in the custodial break room, wearing an oversized gray uniform and scuffed sneakers he hadn't worn in years. Carl Hendricks, the school's operations manager, gave him a cursory glance and a clipboard. "You're just filling in, right? Temporary night crew? Stick with Randy or Marcus, don't get in the way." It was a chillingly casual welcome, flat, dismissive, and telling. As Daniel was introduced around, it became clear who ran this shift. Randy, barrel-chested and full of bluster, barely looked up from his phone. Marcus, lean and sharp-eyed, offered a smirk. "New guy? Good, maybe now we can clock out early." They treated the school like a personal playground, half-effort tasks, skipped protocols, and zero supervision. Daniel made mental notes as they toured the facility, but it wasn't until they passed the science wing that something caught his attention. A lone figure, wiping down lab counters with quiet precision. Young, mid-20s maybe, uniformed, spotless, tools organized to military efficiency. He didn't look up, but his movements were methodical and purposeful. "That's Miguel," Carl said, barely slowing his pace. "Deaf kid, reads lips okay, doesn't talk much. We keep him busy with the easy stuff." There was a tone in Carl's voice, condescending, as if Miguel were a checkbox on a corporate diversity report rather than a person. But Daniel saw something different. Miguel didn't just clean, he cared. While the others grumbled and joked, Miguel was already halfway through prepping the next classroom without being asked. He moved like someone who had learned to work in silence not by choice, but by necessity. As the shift wore on, Daniel watched the contrast grow starker. Randy and Marcus took breaks that stretched into hours. Miguel skipped his, staying late to finish what others left behind. He never complained. He never asked for help. No one acknowledged his effort. That night, under the stale hum of overhead lights and the indifference of his co-workers, Daniel witnessed the quiet dignity of a man the world had chosen not to hear. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt ashamed, not of what he'd built, but of what he'd stopped seeing. It didn't take long for Daniel to realize that something was very wrong, not just with the people, but with the tools themselves. On his second night while shadowing the others, he noticed Miguel struggling to fix a leaky pipe near the cafeteria kitchen. The wrench he was using was old and bent, the gloves on his hands were patched with electrical tape, and the mop bucket nearby had one wheel missing, forcing him to drag it in jerking, uneven motions across the tile. Daniel stepped in to help, gently offering a better wrench he'd found abandoned in the supply closet. Miguel looked surprised but nodded in thanks. Later, when Daniel asked Carl why the tools were in such poor condition, the manager just scoffed. "We make do, budgets got cut." Again? Besides, Miguel's used to it. He doesn't complain. That last comment sat like acid in Daniel's stomach. He distinctly remembered approving a generous maintenance supply budget just 3 months prior. Where had that money gone? Over the next few nights, the pattern repeated. Miguel repaired classroom desks with glue that barely held, cleaned science labs without gloves, and substituted safe cleaning agents with harsh chemicals labeled in faded ink. Meanwhile, Randy and Marcus hoarded the better equipment in a locked cabinet, snickering whenever Miguel had to improvise. "He likes being the hero," Marcus whispered once when Miguel jury-rigged a broken mop handle with duct tape. "Let him feel useful." Daniel stayed quiet, his blood boiling. This wasn't just budget mismanagement, it was strategic neglect. Tools weren't simply worn, they were withheld. And Miguel, because of his silence, his difference, and his refusal to fight back, had become the easiest target. Daniel began noticing the emotional weight Miguel carried. The stiff shoulders, the slight limp at the end of each shift, the way he kept his eyes down when Carl passed. He was a man surviving, not living. A worker no one thanked, but everyone depended on. By treating his tools as disposable, they'd made it easier to see him that way, too. For Daniel, the metaphor hit hard. In his pursuit of scaling excellence, had he built a system that quietly crushed people like Miguel? Discarded tools, discarded people. That night, as he returned to his hotel, Daniel couldn't stop thinking of Miguel's hands. Cracked, reddened, yet still moving with purpose. He realized something. Fixing the budget wouldn't be enough. This would take dismantling a culture that had mistaken silence for weakness. By the fourth night, Daniel could no longer remain just a passive observer. He found Miguel in the auditorium, quietly scrubbing scuff marks off the hardwood stage floor with a toothbrush-sized brush and a bucket of lukewarm water. It was a task no one else would have volunteered for. Tedious, backbreaking, and largely invisible. Daniel crouched beside him and tapped gently on the floor to get his attention. When Miguel looked up, Daniel made sure to speak slowly and clearly, allowing him to read his lips. "You always work like this?" Miguel gave a small nod and reached for his phone. After a moment of typing, he held up the screen. "If I don't, it won't get done right." That quiet honesty hit Daniel harder than any spreadsheet ever had. Over the next hour, they sat together during break, communicating through text messages. Gradually, Miguel began to open up, not with complaints, but with facts. He'd reported safety issues once, nearly a year ago, when Randy left a chemical cabinet unlocked near a lower school classroom. Instead of addressing it, Carl blamed Miguel, claiming his cleaning logs were falsified. He was then reprimanded and quietly reassigned more work with fewer resources. "I tried," Miguel typed, "but he said he'd have proof I was incompetent, and I can't speak for myself. I can't win." Daniel felt the weight of those words. He thought of every leadership seminar he'd ever hosted, preaching open-door policies and values-based management. None of that had reached Miguel. The young man had been left to fight a silent war against indifference and sabotage, with no allies, no voice, and no way to defend his integrity. And yet, despite it all, he stayed. "Why?" when Daniel asked, Miguel hesitated, then typed, "The kids. They shouldn't have to learn in a dirty place. They deserve better." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, not just guilt, but awe. Miguel wasn't here because he needed a paycheck. He was here because he believed in the purpose of the place, even when its leaders had forgotten it. As Daniel walked back to the staff locker room, he knew something had shifted. Miguel wasn't just a victim. He was the moral center of this school. And Daniel, in his silence as a distant executive, had been complicit in letting men like Carl take over the narrative. That would end. The debt of silence had grown too large. It was time to pay it back with action. Daniel knew that words wouldn't be enough to dismantle the rot inside Sterling Heights. He needed proof. Proof the board couldn't ignore, that parents couldn't explain away, and that would expose Carl and his inner circle for what they were. So, he designed a trap. It started with a forged work order, a fake request from a prominent donor for emergency restoration of the gymnasium's historic oak floor before a weekend fundraiser. Daniel knew Carl's greed and obsession with appearances would kick in. Right on cue, Carl assigned the job to Randy and Marcus, calling it PR Gold. But as expected, they pawned the work off to Miguel, dumping a rusted polisher beside him with barely a grunt. Daniel had already arranged the rest. Security cameras discreetly focused on the gym floor, a time-stamped work log filed accidentally by Naomi showing the real assignments, and a hidden backup of maintenance footage copied to an off-site server. When Daniel entered the gym around 9 p.m., he found Miguel, alone, exhausted, yet focused, pushing the industrial polisher in slow, sweeping arcs. His shirt was soaked, his gloved hands blistered, and his knee was wrapped in duct tape from an earlier fall he hadn't reported. But the floor gleamed like a mirror. "Still working?" Daniel asked gently, making sure Miguel could see his lips. Miguel shrugged and typed, "They said the donor needs it perfectly. School's reputation matters." That phrase, "school's reputation," hit Daniel like a punch to the ribs. Not because it was wrong, but because it was being used against someone who actually cared. He offered Miguel a water bottle and quietly helped sweep sawdust from the corners. Miguel didn't question it. He was used to working in silence, with no praise, no help, and no expectation of recognition. But Daniel wasn't here to let that happen again. Every moment of that night, the isolation, the labor, the misplaced credit, was being recorded, not to shame Miguel, but to honor him, because traps built on cruelty crumble. But traps built with respect, with truth, they exposed the rot without ever staining the good. And Daniel, for the first time in years, felt sure that when the reckoning came, it wouldn't just bring punishment, it would bring justice. Justice for the man who had polished that floor, not for applause, but because he believed in the school more than the people who ran it. By sunrise, the gym floor shimmered like polished glass, every inch a testament to one man's silent dedication. But the spotlight wouldn't be on the floor that morning. It would be on the truth. Daniel arrived in a crisp navy suit, no longer Dan the janitor, but Daniel Whitaker, CEO of Sterling Scholars. He entered through the front doors just as faculty began filtering in, their conversations hushed by the unfamiliar sight. At 8:30 a.m. an all-staff assembly was called under the guise of welcoming a surprise donor. Teachers, office staff, custodians, and even a few early-arriving parents filled the auditorium with curious murmurs. Carl stood proudly off to the side, rehearsing a speech about excellence in operations and nodding smugly toward the freshly polished gym. Then Daniel stepped onto the stage. At first no one recognized him, then came the stunned gasps. The man they knew from framed photos and quarterly emails was now standing before them in the flesh, eyes calm but fierce. "Good morning," he said, pausing long enough to let the weight of his presence settle. "I've been here with you this past week, not as a CEO, as a janitor, and what I witnessed broke my heart. A hush fell. Daniel reached into a folder and began listing facts: falsified time logs, stolen overtime pay, unsafe working conditions, and targeted harassment against a deaf employee who had, in truth, carried the weight of the school on his back. Naomi stepped forward, confirming the doctored records and offering physical copies of backup documentation. The room shifted from shock to anger. Carl tried to interrupt, stammering about misunderstandings and policy confusion, but Daniel raised a hand. "Enough," he said, his voice slicing clean. "You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Security is waiting." Randy and Marcus were next. They shrank under the weight of Daniel's stare. "You mocked integrity. You sabotaged someone better than you'll ever understand. You're done here." Gasps rippled through the staff, but Daniel wasn't finished. He turned to the back of the room where Miguel stood, trying to stay out of sight. "And now," Daniel said, his tone softening, "I'd like to recognize the person who saved this school's soul." He gestured for Miguel to step forward. The staff rose to their feet in a standing ovation, many with tears in their eyes. And Miguel, overwhelmed, simply placed a hand over his heart. It was the first time anyone had truly seen him, not as a janitor, but as the cornerstone of their community. The shock of Daniel's reveal reverberated well beyond the school walls. Within hours of the assembly, news of the CEO's undercover operation and the exposed exploitation spread across the district. Parents who had arrived early for the weekend fundraiser, many of them longtime donors, had witnessed the public firings firsthand. Word of mouth turned into phone calls, and by noon local media had picked up the story. But Daniel wasn't interested in optics. He was focused on accountability. Carl Hendricks, Randy, and Marcus were formally terminated with cause, escorted out by security. Their severance was revoked, pending a full financial investigation. Daniel issued a statement to the board and parent community, detailing the abuse of power and the measures being taken to restore integrity. Naomi, the quiet receptionist who had risked her job to come forward, was publicly commended and promoted to head of administrative compliance. Her voice cracked as she accepted, visibly relieved to finally be heard. Miguel, however, stayed in the background, avoiding attention even as Daniel praised his work ethic again during the staff debrief. When asked to speak, he typed a brief message on his phone and handed it to Daniel. Daniel read it aloud. "I'm not angry, just glad people know now. Not for me, for the next person." The room fell silent again, not out of awkwardness, but respect. In that moment, the staff understood what Daniel had come to see days earlier. Miguel wasn't just a hard-working janitor, he was the moral compass they'd ignored. Daniel announced immediate structural reforms, a full audit across all campuses, anonymous reporting systems, mandatory ASL training for all frontline staff, and a new employee protection program named after Miguel, the Rivera Initiative. When a reporter asked him later why he didn't just fire Carl quietly and move on, Daniel responded plainly, "Because that's how problems like this survive, in silence, in shadows. If we're going to change our culture, the consequences have to be visible." That day, a new standard was set, not just in Sterling Heights, but across the entire Sterling Scholars Network. The message was clear: dignity matters. People matter. And when leadership listens, the voiceless can finally be heard. For the staff who had looked the other way, the lesson was stark. For those who had suffered silently, it was a turning point. And for Daniel, it was the beginning of a long overdue reckoning, not just with his team, but with himself. The days following the assembly were filled with cautious optimism and quiet determination. Gone were the hushed whispers in the halls, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose among the staff. For the first time in years, the Sterling Heights campus felt awake, not just operational but alive. Daniel moved quickly. An interim operations manager was brought in from the central office, hand-picked for her record of ethical leadership and empathy-driven reform. Naomi began leading weekly team meetings focused on transparency, communication, and inclusivity. But it was Miguel who drew the most attention, not for how loudly he spoke, but for the quiet way he led. Daniel offered him the role of campus facilities director, complete with full authority over maintenance staff, scheduling, and budgeting. Miguel hesitated at first, fingers hovering over his phone screen, unsure of how to respond. "Won't some parents or staff be uncomfortable?" he finally typed. Daniel's reply was firm and immediate. "Then they can take their complaints to me. You earned this. You've always earned this." Miguel accepted with conditions. He asked that the janitorial team be retrained under new standards of integrity and that any future hires be interviewed in person by a panel that included both administrators and custodial staff. "No more invisible workers," he typed. "Everyone matters." Daniel agreed without hesitation. Over the next 2 weeks, changes ripple outward. A local nonprofit was brought in to begin ASL training for all school personnel. Students were invited to join the first session. And to everyone's surprise, the auditorium was full. Some came to support Miguel, others came out of curiosity. But what emerged was something more lasting: connection. One student stood up and signed "Thank you" during a school-wide morning announcement, a small gesture that brought tears to Miguel's eyes. Meanwhile, Daniel continued auditing other campuses, uncovering similar patterns in isolated pockets. But now, he had a model to fix them, one built not on top-down control, but on shared accountability. Sterling Heights had gone from the system's cautionary tale to its blueprint for change. The school that once ignored its hardest worker now wore his legacy like a badge of honor. And as Miguel walked the halls, head high, tablet in hand, students waving as he passed, it was clear to everyone, this wasn't just about cleaning floors anymore. This was about building a culture where no one gets left behind in the silence. 3 months later, Sterling Heights was nearly unrecognizable. Not because of flashy renovations or marketing campaigns, but because the atmosphere had changed. Respect lived in the details. Students now greeted all staff by name. ASL signage adorned classroom doors, and teachers collaborated more freely with custodial teams than ever before. Morning announcements included safety tips from Miguel's department, and every Friday ended with a quiet hero spotlight. An initiative started by Naomi, inspired by Miguel's story. Daniel visited the campus one crisp autumn morning, unannounced, but immediately recognized by students, who now saw him not just as a CEO, but as a man who had listened when no one else did. He found Miguel in the staff garden, trimming back ivy that had overgrown the school's outer wall. The same calm focus, the same gentle diligence. Only now, Miguel wore a Sterling Heights jacket with "Facilities Director" stitched across the front in bold navy thread. Daniel stepped beside him, holding out a folder. "I haven't forgotten," he said. Inside was an offer. Director of Technical Operations for the entire Sterling Scholars Network. The role would involve training facility staff across all 12 campuses, designing accountability protocols, and mentoring new hires. Miguel read the proposal carefully, then typed his response. "Maybe someday, but this place still needs me. The roots aren't strong yet." Daniel smiled, humbled once again by Miguel's quiet wisdom. "Then we'll build the rest from here." Before leaving, Daniel asked one final question that had tugged at him for weeks. "Miguel, when did you know I wasn't really a janitor?" Miguel chuckled, then typed, "The way you watched. Not just the tasks, but how people were treated. Janitors care about floors. Leaders care about people." That answer stayed with Daniel long after he left the campus. It became the closing line in a speech he would later deliver at an education summit titled "Leadership in Silence." The story of Sterling Heights spread, not as a scandal, but as a rebirth. It became a case study in how a school turned its culture around by listening to the person no one had listened to. And while Daniel continued his work across the country, he carried with him the image of a young man in a gray uniform, scrubbing floors under fluorescent lights, never asking for praise, only a fair chance to do the job right. That was Miguel's legacy. A school rebuilt, not with noise, but with quiet conviction, one hallway at a time. The story of Sterling Heights teaches us that true leadership isn't found in corner offices or polished speeches. It's revealed in moments of quiet action and moral clarity. Daniel Whitaker, a successful CEO, rediscovered the heart of his mission not through data, but by walking the halls at night. Beside a janitor no one truly saw, Miguel, a deaf custodian, worked with unmatched dedication, integrity, and resilience despite being ignored, overworked, and scapegoated. His silence wasn't weakness, it was strength the world had failed to recognize. The most powerful lesson is that institutions thrive not because of titles, but because of the people who carry the weight quietly and without recognition. When Daniel chose to listen, not just observe, he exposed injustice, rebuilt a broken culture, and empowered a man whose value had long been overlooked. In doing so, he reminded us that justice begins when we choose to see those the world dismisses. Leadership is not about being the loudest in the room, but about amplifying the voices no one hears. If we want real change in business, in education, in life, it begins with asking, who have we failed to notice? And what will we do once we finally see them?